Okay, one. Analysis. The long arm of China and free speech. Doing business in China comes with major strings attached. This week, it became evident that a few provocative words can cause those strings to tighten. A single tweet by Houston's Rockets general manager Daryl Morey in support of pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong unleashed massive retaliation from China that put the team and the entire NBA on notice. China's state TV cut off preseason games and ominously announced it would immediately investigate all cooperation and exchanges involving the NBA. Tencent, a major Chinese social media company with a reported 1.5 billion streaming deal with the NBA, said it will no longer stream Rockets games, even though the team is immensely popular in China. China's message to foreign companies and their employees is clear. Watch what you say on matters sensitive to our country if you want to do business there. This hardball response to Morey and the NBA fits a pattern of threats and reprisals against foreign organizations, wading even unintentionally into the country's sensitive internal politics. Facing boycott threats this summer, Western fashion brands apologized for T-shirts that suggested that Taiwan and Hong Kong were independent countries rather than territories that are part of China. It isn't just top executives who have paid a price for the speech that offends China's sensibilities. Last year, a Marriott employee earning $14 an hour used a company account to like a post on Twitter from a Tibetan separatist group. A Chinese tourism organization demanded an apology and urged Marriott to seriously deal with people responsible. The employee was fired. When China threatens a foreign business, compliance typically prevails over resistance. China's efforts to impose speech controls on international companies and their workers have largely succeeded. Morey deleted his tweet. The NBA put out a statement saying the tweet doesn't represent NBA or the Rockets, which led to an uproar in the US and another statement from the NBA. The league's initial response provoked a torrent of criticism in the United States. In a rare show of unity, leading Democrats and Republicans rebuking the NBA for caving to China and failing to stand up for Morey's free speech rights. American companies have grudgingly accepted all kinds of Chinese rules for years. They may bristle about how they are forced to transfer technology in exchange for access to China's market, and about Chinese cyber spies who threaten their intellectual property. But the potential rewards, all those consumers, a middle class that's expected to reach 550 million by 2022, are just too great to spurn. And that means playing by China's rules. One notable recent exception, South Park, the sardonic, boundary-busting Comedy Central cartoon. Last week's episode, banned in China, appeared to offend authorities so much that all traces of the show, episodes, clips, discussion groups, and social media posts vanished from major platforms in China. South Park's creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, seized on the moment to issue a fake apology mocking China's President Xi Jinping and the NBA. Official apology to China from Trey Parker and Matt Stone. Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. She doesn't look just like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune in to our 300th episode Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May this autumn sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China.
In fairness to
the NBA,
South Park
thrives on political agitation.
The
Basketball League has painstakingly built a thriving connection with hundreds of millions of Chinese fans.
The
NBA has notably supported players and coaches who express their political views on subjects ranging from police violence to guns to President Trump.
But
Daryl Morey's 7-word tweet, "Fight for freedom and stand with Hong Kong," puts the league's progressive image to its sternest test.
On
Tuesday, the well-regarded NBA Commissioner Adam Silver sought to clarify the league's position, saying it would protect its employees' freedom of speech, while at the same time apologizing to the league's fans in China. The apology failed to diffuse the league's crisis. China's state-run television network said it was strongly dissatisfied with Silver's remarks, and it bluntly declared that any speech challenging China's social stability doesn't fall within the realm of freedom of speech. The Chinese message is loud and clear. Your free speech ends at the water's edge.
The free world at 30.
If you don't fight for democracy, you don't deserve it. Perhaps you know the story of the parrot in Soviet Russia that escapes from its cage and flies out the window. Its owner rushes out and hurries down to the Ministry of State Security. "I want to assure you," he tells the Soviet agents, "in case the situation arises, that my parrot's views are not my own." None of us want to live in a society where we worry what our parrots might say, nor for that matter in a society where the presidential parrot would repeat, "I am a genius, America first, witch hunt, coup." China has banned Winnie the Pooh online and in theaters. Pooh, who memorably said, "People say nothing is impossible, but I do nothing every day," among other incendiary remarks. A society that bans Winnie the Pooh because of a supposed resemblance to its great leader is a society with some serious issues. As the 3-decade mark of the fall of the Berlin Wall approaches, free speech must be safeguarded with great tenacity, for when it dies, when truth dies, the worst becomes possible and probably inevitable. I have been attending the Athens Democracy Forum, a gathering organized in association with the New York Times. There, I met Magdalena Adamovich. Her husband, Pavel Adamovich, was murdered this year, earlier in Nest, the quintessentially European city in Poland, of which he was mayor. She reminded me, with the solemn force of her dignity, that we must do better in the regulation of hate speech. But freedom of expression also protects, and perhaps above all protects, the ideas we hate. That is the price of freedom, and freedom must be relearned every day. I will hear echoing in my mind for some time Adamovich's appeal. Education. When her husband was stabbed to death, one of his last words was solidarity, with a small s, as Donald Tusk, the outgoing president of the European Council, observed. This, then, was a frenzied attempt to take a knife to the universal human connection, above and beyond barriers of class, race, and religion that the walls of nationalists are built to deny. Digitized democracy in the 21st century cannot be the democracy of the 20th century. At the same time, even as institutions must adapt, and the connected tissues of our societies must be rewoven, and our economies reinvented, an obligation exists to defend the values that provided the framework of the 20th century's international order. Freedom and openness, the rule of law, human rights, democracy and self-determination, security and free market opportunity.
No
No
wrong-headed
wrong-headed American
abdication
abdication can diminish the importance of this task.
I do
not believe this undertaking can be advanced through nationalism and barriers, myth-making and drum rolls, incitement and xenophobia. Been there, done that, suffered. The end point of nationalism, as François Mitterrand observed, is war. That is no less true today than it was in the Normandy landings. Yes, when the Kurds were unpardonably absent. President Trump does take your breath away. Perhaps he intends to resettle the Kurds in Greenland. Words are fine, but without deeds, they fade into the mist. The doers admonished everyone in Athens. Nathan Law, a Hong Kong politician and activist, said, "We stand with the defenders of liberty everywhere. In Hong Kong, we are the forefront of the clash of authoritarian and liberal values. If communism prevails, that will threaten all liberal democracies." I agree. Qasim Eid, author and brave survivor of the Syrian bloodbath. If you don't fight for democracy, you don't deserve it. I bow my head. Paul Pullman, the former head of Unilever, on the lesson of the Great Recession of 2008. Banks were too big to fail, and people too small to matter. I have not heard a better summation. Even Kratzovitz, a political scientist, on the power of myth. More Hungarians believe they have seen an unidentified flying object than believe they have met a refugee. Yet xenophobic illiberalism works for Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Hungary. Nothing is easier or more dangerous than cultivation of hatred of the stranger. We must be humble and listen and heed the forgotten voices. As Kyriakos Mitsotakis, Prime Minister of Greece, put it, there have been massive failure of elites to understand the new cleavages. Complacency and contempt have been liberal democracy's worst enemies. It is not the prerogative of the globalized city dweller to ignore the concerns of all the living on what the French call the periphery. Democracies have the merit of giving expression to discontent. That is what we have witnessed in the recent nationalist wave, a reaction by the invisible and marginalized to globalization's masters of the universe. Life, as some sage once observed, is a predicament that precedes death. Our struggles are not as new or as different as we imagine. The tension between freedom and equality is not new. The struggle between humanity and the machine is not new. The human susceptibility to folly is not new. What is new, above all, is the means we now have, if we would only use them right, to build a connected world of dignity and decency. For a long time, over the course of my life, I watched liberty and democracy and openness spread, not steadily, but in spurts, not smoothly or evenly, but falteringly and unevenly. The fall of the Berlin Wall and wars of Yugoslavia's destructions were pivot points in my life that cemented the link between America and freedom, America and peace. Alone among nations, the United States could make me an insider overnight. That is why New York is my home. Today, American patriotism, as I understand it, requires this: the defense of the Constitution, the rule of law, truth, freedom, and the planet itself, against the ravages issuing from the White House and its increasingly deranged occupant. Each of us has a journey. I am a Jew of South African descent, raised in Britain, shaped by France, an American now. These are the threads of my story, and where they have left me is right here in Athens, where democracy began, as part of a conference I cherish. I am a bridge, not a wall person. How could I be anything else? China blows whistle on nationalistic protests against the NBA. Beijing. After 3 days of fanning nationalistic outrage, the Chinese government abruptly moved on Thursday to tamp down public anger at the NBA as concerns spread in Beijing that the rhetoric was damaging China's interests and image around the world. For days, China's state-run news outlets and tightly controlled social media platforms have been alight with criticism of the NBA after a Houston Rockets executive expressed support for Hong Kong's anti-government protesters on Twitter. Plans to broadcast 2 NBA preseason games were canceled, and some Chinese companies suspended partnerships with the league. Now, the Chinese government appears to be reassessing its campaign against the NBA and dialing down the clamor. The government is already in a bruising trade war with the United States, and a backlash against China could hurt its image in the sporting world ahead of the 2022 Winter Olympics near Beijing. The dispute with the NBA was also quickly politicizing an audience of sports fans who would normally not focus on issues like the protests in Hong Kong. Editors at state news outlets have told reporters to avoid emphasizing the NBA issue for fear that it might become overheated, according to interviews with 3 journalists on Thursday. The controversy soon fell off the government-guided list of the top 10 trending topics on Weibo, the country's Twitter-like microblogging service. The authorities did not cancel Thursday's preseason NBA game in Shanghai. And even the highly nationalistic Global Times tabloid stopped pushing populist indignation over the tweet. I think this issue will gradually de-escalate. Global Times will not push to keep it hot, Hu Xijin, the newspaper's top editor, wrote in an electronic response to a request for comment. I hope the American side won't make any moves to escalate it. China's foreign ministry spokesman refused to say anything further about the dispute at Thursday's news briefing. The Chinese backlash sought to pressure the NBA to be more critical of the Rockets' general manager, Daryl Morey, who had since deleted the pro-Hong Kong tweet. The NBA initially apologized for the remarks, but no further action, and its commissioner later defended the league's employees' right to free speech. For many observers, the issue quickly became a reminder that navigating commerce in an increasingly political China can be a minefield for international companies. Beijing officials worry that a highly politicized struggle over the Hong Kong protests might hurt the 2 days of high-level trade talks starting on Thursday in Washington. Vice Premier Liu He is leading the Chinese negotiating team in Washington, and 2 people familiar with the talks said that the Chinese side was ready to conclude a partial deal with the Trump administration. The protests may cause high-profile athletes and their fans around the world to pay attention to the Hong Kong protests for the first time, and their sympathies might lie with the protesters instead of Beijing, one of the 2 people involved said. Both of them insisted on anonymity because of the sensitivity of the trade and the nationalism issues evoked. tying sports very closely to Beijing's handle of the Hong Kong protests
may increase the
risk of an international boycott of the Winter Olympics to be held in China in 2022 at a town just outside of Beijing. China has been wary for many months of a possible boycott. Chinese officials have been quick to point out in recent months that China did send its athletic teams to the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984, despite a Soviet-organized boycott that year in retaliation for the American-led boycott of the Moscow Games 4 years earlier. China itself did not send a team to the Moscow Olympics, however, but supported the American boycott in 1980. The campaign against the NBA also put in an awkward position the many retailers that have large stocks of merchandise carrying various brands of the NBA. Businesses are reluctant to write off the value of this inventory. The basketball issue was also drawing an unwelcome attention to Alibaba, a Chinese electronic commerce giant that is trying to expand in the United States to compete with Amazon, and that has sought to avoid becoming mired in political disputes between China and the United States. Joseph Tsai, a co-founder of Alibaba, also owns the Brooklyn Nets and jumped into the controversy over the tweet. He issued a strongly worded statement on Facebook calling for respect and understanding for China's desire to oppose any form of separatism after a long history of intervention by foreign powers. Hong Kong. Arrest of 750 children during protests sparks outcry. Hong Kong officials say a third of 2,379 protesters arrested during 4 months of protests are under 18. Hong Kong officials have revealed that 750 of the protesters arrested during 4 months of unrest are children, sparking outrage in the city as anger continues to grow over the government's increasingly hardline measures against demonstrators. The semi-autonomous city's #2 official, Matthew Chung, said at a press conference on Thursday that it was shocked. It was shocking and heartbreaking that 750 of 2,379 people arrested, or nearly a third, since June, were under 18, and 104 were under 16. Zhang appealed to parents and teachers to admonish youngsters and tell them to refrain from illegal or violent acts and avoid getting injured or arrested, something that would end up destroying their future. A high proportion of children arrested sparked outrage in the community. The government says this is heartbreaking, but doesn't ask why. Youth is rising up. They know they're fighting for their future against a dictatorial regime, said Kong Sun-gan, an author and well-known blogger on Twitter. Totalitarianism is going to destroy our next generation. Resist, wrote another person on Twitter. On Tuesday, Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam said after school term started in September, nearly 40% of those arrested were under 18, while 10% of those arrested last Sunday were under 15. A growing number of children have been arrested or injured in the increasingly violent and radical protests in recent weeks. A Hong Kong policeman fired at an 18-year-old high school student's chest during heated, territory-wide protests on China's National Day on the 1st of October, while a 14-year-old was shot in the thigh by a plainclothes police officer last Friday during protests against the anti-mask ban. In a recent protest, an 11-year-old was sent to the hospital after sustaining an injury. Lam announced last Friday that the government had invoked the Emergency Regulations Ordinance to pass a regulation forbidding the use of face masks.
There are widespread fears
that
that the government would introduce more draconian measures to suppress civil freedoms. While Lam said she cared deeply for students, she insisted that they should not participate in violent acts, attacks,
and the
and the
anti-mask
ban was aimed at helping parents, teachers, and students recognize that they shouldn't be engaged in these acts. Schools across Hong Kong required parents to sign a notice saying they understood masks should not be worn inside or outside schools, despite the fact that the ban applies only to public protests or assemblies. The Secretary for Education, Kevin Young, told reporters on Friday that the Education Bureau has required schools to report the number of students who wear masks to school after the ban was announced, but it stressed it was not going after schools or students. When young people are on the streets fighting selflessly, they are called criminals and rioters, said Kenneth Chan, a political science professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. The gap between the young people and the officials is impossible to bridge now. It is a total breakdown of trust between the government and young people. It can only get worse because Carrie Lam has nothing but harsh measures to suppress and intimidate the young people and their parents. After China objects, Apple removes app used by Hong Kong protesters. Scott Newman. Apple has removed from its App Store a smartphone app used by Hong Kong pro-democracy activists to crowdsource the location of protesters and police after Chinese state media suggested the tech giant was siding with rioters. Apple initially rejected the app last week, saying that it encourages an activity that is not legal and allows users to evade law enforcement, according to its developers. Nonetheless, Hong Kong Map.live did briefly become available in the App Store before Apple announced Wednesday that it was being removed. We have learned that an app, Hong Kong Map.live, has been used in ways that endanger law enforcement and residents in Hong Kong, Apple said in a statement. Many concerned customers in Hong Kong have contacted us about this app, and we immediately began investigating it. The app, it said, has been used to target and ambush police, threaten public safety, and criminals have used it to victimize residents in areas where they know there is no law enforcement. HKMap.live reportedly consolidates reports from social media and then uses the information to plot the locations of protests and such information as where the police are using tear gas. The protesters have staged months of protests in the former British colony, demanding universal suffrage and the right to choose Hong Kong's leadership. The level of violence has grown in recent weeks, with protesters wrecking storefronts and hurling gasoline bombs. Police have responded with tear gas, batons, and in some cases, live ammunition. Apple chose to approve the app in the App Store in Hong Kong at this point, the editorial said. Does this mean Apple intended to be an accomplice to the rioters? People have reason to assume that Apple is mixing business with politics and even illegal acts, it said. Apple has to think about the consequences of its unwise and reckless decision. Responding to Apple's decision to withdraw the app, its developers, who have not identified themselves because of security concerns, responded in a series of tweets on Thursday, reports the South China Morning Post, a Hong Kong-based English language daily. We once believed the app rejection was simply a bureaucratic F-up, but now it is clearly a political decision to suppress freedom and human rights in Hong Kong, the developer said, according to the Post. Although HKMap.live has been removed from the Apple App Store, it remains available on an independent website. The Hong Kong unrest is a sensitive issue in Beijing, and anyone seen as showing sympathy or support for the protesters has come in for sharp criticism. Earlier this week, Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey touched off a heated controversy by tweeting support for the Hong Kong protesters, although he quickly deleted the tweet and expressed contrition. That didn't stop the Chinese Basketball Association from suspending its business dealings with the Rockets. Tencent, a Chinese media partner with the NBA in China, also ended a streaming deal worth $1.5 billion, and China's state television said it would stop airing the Rockets games. FIFA disciplines Hong Kong Football Association after Chinese national anthem protest. FIFA fined the Hong Kong Football Association Wednesday after fans protested the Chinese national anthem at a World Cup qualifying game against Iran. The Hong Kong and China national teams are separate, but FIFA plays the Chinese national anthem because Hong Kong is considered an administrative region of China. Disciplinary records said that Hong Kong supporters breached Article 16 of the FIFA disciplinary code by disturbing a national anthem and using objects to transmit a message that is not appropriate for sports events. The Hong Kong Football Association has been ordered to pay 15,000 Swiss francs, 15,000 US dollars, and was given a warning. Hong Kong football officials can appeal the decision. A video taken during the September game shows supporters facing backward and booing as China's national anthem plays. During halftime, Hong Kong fans surrounded the stadium, locked arms, and sang "Glory to Hong Kong," a song widely adopted as a protest anthem. Though Hong Kong lost to Iran 2-0, protesters were happy to use the game to increase awareness to their cause. The emotion here is good, though we lost, Hong Kong supporter Liu Fan told the AP. We will fight till the end. The Hong Kong Football Association have yet to comment on their sanction. During the 2018 World Cup qualifiers, Hong Kong was disciplined 3 times. All 3 incidents involved the booing of the Chinese national anthem. Hong Kong was fined twice, totaling about $15,000. FIFA isn't the only sporting federation to involve itself in the Hong Kong liberation movement. Earlier this week, the Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey tweeted support for Hong Kong protesters. The Chinese Basketball Association then announced it will suspend cooperation with the Rockets. The league's commissioner clarified Tuesday that the NBA supports free speech after the Rockets' owner and an NBA spokesman denounced Morey's statement. Has the trade war taken a bite out of China's economy? Yes, but it's complicated. In the industrial city of Dongguan, China, the effects of the trade war on the Chinese economy are measured in idled machinery and empty bar stools. 1 year ago, you probably couldn't even get through the crowd because it would be so busy. But right now, even the smallest vendors can't survive, says Song Guanghui. The market, the owner of Crowd Bar, a tricked-out food stall in an open-air market in Dongguan. The market is across the street from an enormous factory complex that specializes in making shoes. Crowd bar's flashy electric sign, cold beer, and bombastic owner used to draw crowds of workers at a shift change. But shoes are among the thousands of products that the Trump administration has slapped double-digit tariffs on since the trade war began in early 2018. Trade talks between the U.S. and China resumed Thursday, but it is a deal that is far from done. Meanwhile, 70% of footwear sold in America is imported from China. And with tariffs cutting into their bottom lines, many manufacturers have already relocated operations to countries like Vietnam and Indonesia. That has left Song and Crowd War short of workers to buy his barbecue skewers and beer. I'm probably going to pick up and move elsewhere. If I stay here for much longer, I'm not going to be able to make it. There are clues like this about the Chinese economy's health nearly everywhere in Dongguan. It's a sprawling manufacturing hub of more than 8 million people in southern China, nicknamed the workshop of the world. Cities like Dongguan are among the hardest hit in a trade war that targets goods manufactured on razor-sharp margins. I think there's a pretty major impact if you just look at the numbers, says Victor Shi, a political economist at the University of California, San Diego, who studies the Chinese economy. China exports more goods to the U.S. than to any other country in the world, and those exports have dropped by more than 12% this year alone, he says. That drop has clearly hit the Chinese manufacturing sector. Industrial output growth in China fell to its lowest level in 17 years this summer. On top of the trade war, China's economic growth has been slowing down for years. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly how many of China's current economic troubles are due to the trade war or the existing slump. But tariffs have undoubtedly contributed to slower growth since the early months of 2018, when the economic standoff began, experts on the Chinese economy say. President Trump's trade war has hit the U.S. as well. Economist Arthur Kroeber, head of research at Gavical Dragonomics, said that tariffs have made products imported from China more expensive. The brunt of the burden of tariffs is being borne by U.S. consumers, Kroeber says. American farmers who've had retaliatory tariffs placed on the goods they export to China have also suffered, despite aid packages supplied by the U.S. government. The Chinese government has many more tools at its disposal to alleviate some of the trade war's pressures. The central government recently slashed taxes on business and corporations to help cushion the blow. The government also devalued its currency so that Chinese goods were cheaper and thus would be more attractive to trade partners around the world. Another tool available to the central government, experts say, is massaging official data coming out of Beijing. The official unemployment rate in China, for instance, has hovered between 4.3% and 3.6% for nearly 20 years. A lack of fluctuation beyond a percentage point for such a period of time is highly unusual. And the government even shut down the release of regional manufacturing statistics out of Dongguan province, where Dongguan is located, that cast doubt on rosy national numbers. Guangdong province, yes. But if some of the data is not to be trusted, anecdotal evidence on the ground in Dongguan paints a somewhat clearer picture. On the dusty outskirts of the city, a dog of indeterminate heritage blazes in front of the entrance to the Dongguan Fangjie Printing and Packaging Company. The mood inside the plastic bag factory, however, is one of brisk efficiency. Workers in green polo shirts and blue caps monitor machines spitting out brightly colored plastic bags for detergent, candy, and dog poop. We make about 15 different kinds of doggy doodah bags. Until the trade war, Devereaux's business was called China Savvy. But earlier this year, he changed the name because increasingly he's working in factories outside China. In fact, he recently pulled most of his clients out of the factory. NBA calls off news conferences. NBA calls off news conferences for players in China as controversy lingers. After several days of controversy, the NBA will complete its exhibition series in China with Saturday's game between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Brooklyn Nets. But the league says basketball players, including two of the game's biggest stars in LeBron James and Kyrie Irving, will not address the media in news conferences after. While no formal conferences will take place, a league source tells NPR that if the Lakers and Nets decide to hold their media gatherings independent of the NBA, they are welcome to do so, and that there would be no repercussions from the league. The source also says the league hasn't had any discussions about what the teams might decide. Saturday's game will end a rocky week between the NBA and China, sparked by an NBA team executive's since-deleted tweet voicing support for the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. The NBA said it canceled news conferences for the rest of its games in China after conferring with players and teams. We've decided to not hold media availability for our teams for the remainder of our trip in China, the NBA says in a statement. been placed into a complicated and unprecedented situation while abroad, and we believe it would be unfair to ask them to address these matters in real time, the league says of their players. As NPR's Emily Fung reports from Hong Kong, the NBA is referring to fallout after Daryl Morey, the Houston Rockets general manager, tweeted in support of Hong Kong protests that unleashed a storm of criticism in China, and China's state broadcaster and giant tech Tencent dropped streaming this week of 2 NBA preseason games being played in China. ESPN reports the NBA nixed a scheduled press conference Thursday that was set to take place before a game in Shanghai. That game between the Nets and Lakers was played with a stipulation by the Chinese government mandating that no media availability of any kind be held at the game, and that the NBA commissioner, Adam Silver, canceled his pre-game conference, ESPN says. The NBA spent much of the week trying to get past the controversy that began after Morey tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." That tweet was quickly deleted, but not before thrusting the league into a vexing position in China. Several Chinese officials and businesses, including the Chinese Basketball Association, headed by former NBA star and Hall of Famer Yao Ming, said they would drop their dealings with the Rockets. The NBA, like many other U.S. businesses, wants to grow its business in China, where basketball is wildly popular. The league's initial statements, issued in both English and Mandarin, exposed the NBA to criticism that it was attempting to appease China at the cost of traditional U.S. values, such as free speech. The fallout forced the NBA to issue another statement and hold a news conference to reaffirm the league's stance that it will not censor players or teams. The long-held values of the NBA are to support the freedom of expression, and certainly freedom of expression by members of the NBA community, Silver said, speaking at a news conference near Tokyo earlier this week. Trump reaches Phase 1 deal with China and delays planned tariffs. President Trump said Friday that the United States had reached an interim deal with China that would forestall a tariff increase slated for next week, providing a temporary détente in a prolonged and economically painful trade war. Mr. Trump, speaking from the Oval Office, said negotiators had reached a Phase 1 agreement that would take several weeks to write, and that both sides could officially sign by November. If completed, the agreement would provide relief to American farmers and businesses that have been battered by the trade war. Mr. Trump said substantial agreement would involve China buying $40 billion to $50 billion worth of American agricultural products annually, along with guidelines on how it manages its currency, the renminbi. It would also strengthen Chinese protections for American intellectual property and give financial service companies more access to Chinese market, the president said. In exchange, the United States will not move ahead next week with plans to raise tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods to 30%. The president has not made a final decision on whether to impose an additional round of tariffs on December 15th, as he has threatened. The announcement is a sharp turn from Mr. Trump's posture several weeks ago when the president, angry over China's retaliatory tariffs, demanded that American companies stop doing business with China and threatened to tax every toy, shoe, and computer from Beijing before the year's end. The escalation has rattled investors, lawmakers, and businesses, which have begun delaying investment and hiring amid continuing uncertainty about the trade war's trajectory. The economic pain appears to have softened Mr. Trump's appetite for a fight. On Friday, the president said two sides would now work on a deal in pieces and phases, a reversal from his previous position that he was looking for a complete China deal, not an interim agreement. It's such a big deal that doing it in sections, in phases, is really better, Mr. Trump said during a White House meeting with Liu He, China's vice premier. So you'll either have two phases or three phases. The first phase could be signed when Mr. Trump appears alongside Xi Jinping, his Chinese counterpart, at a meeting of global leaders in Santiago, Chile in November. The next phase would begin soon after, Mr. Trump said. Despite the announcement, the deal has not been completed, and Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, said that more work remained, including on the agreements related to currency and access for American financial companies. We have a fundamental agreement on the key issues, he said, but there is a significant amount of work to do. The deal is far from the type of comprehensive agreement Mr. Trump has been pushing for, and it leaves some of the administration's biggest concerns about China's economic practices unresolved. Although exact terms are still under discussion, the detail the president announced includes some of the concessions that China has previously floated, including purchase of agricultural products and limits on Beijing devaluing its currency to gain competitive advantage. Still, the agreement, which came during the 13th round of negotiations, will help to diffuse trade tensions that have begun inflicting pain on the global economy and bolster business across the Pacific. In his quest to force China to acquiesce to America's terms, Mr. Trump has already taxed $360 billion worth of Chinese products and has penciled in another round of tariffs on December 15th. Doing business in China comes with major strings attached. This week, it became evident that a few provocative words can cause those strings to tighten. A single tweet by Houston Rockets General Manager Daryl Morey in support of pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong unleashed massive retaliation from China that put the team and the entire NBA on notice. China's state TV cut off preseason games and ominously announced it would immediately investigate all cooperation and exchanges involving the NBA. Tencent, a major Chinese social media company with a reported $1.5 billion streaming deal with the NBA, said it will no longer stream Rockets games, even though the team is immensely popular in China. China's message to foreign companies and their employees is clear. Watch what you say on matters sensitive to our country if you wish to do business here. This hardball response to Morey and the NBA fits a pattern of threats and reprisals against foreign organizations wading, even unintentionally, into the country's sensitive internal politics. Facing boycott threats this summer, Western fashion brands apologized for t-shirts that suggested that Taiwan and Hong Kong were independent countries rather than territories that are part of China. It isn't just top executives who've paid a price for speech that offends China's sensibilities. Last year, a Marriott employee earning $14 an hour used a company account to like a post on Twitter from a Tibetan separatist group. A Chinese tourism organization demanded an apology and urged Marriott to seriously deal with the people responsible. The employee was fired when China threatens a foreign business. Compliance typically prevails over resistance. China's effort to impose speech controls on international companies and their workers have largely succeeded. Morey deleted his tweet. The NBA put out a statement saying the tweet doesn't represent the NBA or the Rockets, which led to an uproar in the U.S. and another statement from the NBA. The league's initial response provoked a torrent of criticism in the U.S. in a rare show of unity. Leading Democrats and Republicans rebuked the NBA for caving to China and failing to stand up for Morey's free speech rights. American companies have grudgingly accepted all kinds of Chinese rules for years. They may bristle about how they are forced to transfer technology in exchange for access to China's markets, and about Chinese cyber spies who threaten their intellectual property. But the potential rewards, all those consumers, middle class that's expected to reach 550 million by 2022, are just too great to spurn. And that means playing by China's rules. One notable exception, South Park, the sardonic, boundary-busting Comedy Central cartoon. Last week's episode, banned in China, appeared to offend authorities so much that all traces of the show, episodes, clips, discussion groups, and social media posts vanished from major platforms in China. South Park's creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, seized on the moment to issue a fake apology mocking Chinese President Xi Jinping and the NBA. Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. Xi doesn't look just like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune in to our 300th episode Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May this autumn's sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China? In fairness to the NBA, South Park thrives on political agitation. The Basketball League has painstakingly built a thriving connection with hundreds of millions of Chinese fans. The NBA has notably supported players and coaches who express their political views on subjects ranging from police violence to guns and President Trump. But Daryl Morey's 7-word tweet, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong," puts the league's progressive image to its sternest test. On Tuesday, the well-regarded NBA Commissioner Adam Silver sought to clarify the league's position, saying it would protect its employees' freedom of speech, while at the same time apologizing to the league's fans in China. The apology failed to defuse the league's crisis. China's state-run television network said it was strongly dissatisfied with Silver's remarks, and it bluntly declared that any speech challenging China's social stability doesn't fall within the realm of freedom of speech. The Chinese message is loud and clear. Your free speech ends at the water's edge. Until the trade war, Devereux's business was called China Savvy. But earlier this year, he changed the name because increasingly he's working with factories outside of China. In fact, he recently pulled most of his clients out of the Fangjie factory and moved their businesses to factories in Vietnam because of the tariffs, because of the trade war. And new business has evaporated, he says. My inquiries from American customers about coming to China have dropped off considerably. But Devereux concedes that he has already been considering a move to Vietnam when the opening shots of the trade war were fired. Wages have been going up steadily over the years, which happens when you get a more educated populace, as you see San Diego's shift. A more educated population means fewer low-skilled workers for production lines in factories like Fangjie Printing and Packaging Company. Factories have to offer wages to attract the best workers. And those wages eat into the bottom line of the companies that Devereux places in Chinese factories. If you look at Vietnam now, you've got wages being roughly 1/3 of what they are here in China, says Devereux. And so the trade war merely sped up his move out of China and into Vietnam. 2 or 3 of our American customers, knowing we were looking in Vietnam, asked us to accelerate that when the trade war began, he says. Even in the absence of a trade war, China's growth rate would have come down. The trade war makes it worse, but the trade war is not the primary reason, says Shang Qinwei, an expert on the Chinese economy at Columbia University and former International Monetary Fund official. The real challenges to the Chinese economy, Wei says, are structural issues like a lack of low-skilled workers workers to populate factories, an over-reliance on the manufacturing sector, and an aging workforce. Those factors, Wei says, predate the trade war. In fact, China's GDP growth has dropped by 3 percentage points in the past decade, from a growth rate of 9.6 in 2008 to 6.6 in 2018. Still, at the plastic bag factory in Dongguan, a cluster of brand new machines sits idle. These 4 machines they bought especially for us, says Devereaux, sweeping an arm toward the shiny machines on the factory floor. And now we're saying bye-bye. Trump reaches phase 1 deal with China and delays planned tariffs. President Trump said Friday that the United States had reached an interim deal with China that would forestall a tariff increase slated for next week, providing a temporary détente in a prolonged and economically painful trade war. Mr. Trump, speaking from the Oval Office, said negotiators had reached a phase 1 agreement that would take several weeks to write, and that both sides could officially sign by November. If completed, the trade agreement would provide relief to American farmers and businesses that have been battered by the trade war. Mr. Trump said the substantial agreement would involve China buying $40 billion to $50 billion worth of American agricultural products annually, along with the guidelines on how it manages its currency, the renminbi. It would also strengthen Chinese protections for American intellectual property and give financial service companies more access to the Chinese market, the president said. In exchange, the United States will not move ahead next week with plans to raise tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods to 30%. The president has not made a final decision on whether to impose an additional round of tariffs on December 15th, as he threatened. The announcement is a sharp turn from Mr. Trump's posture several weeks ago, when the president, angry over China's retaliatory tariffs, demanded that American companies stop doing business with China, and threatened to tax every toy, shoe, and computer from Beijing before the year's end. The escalation has rattled investors, lawmakers, and businesses, which have begun delaying investment and hiring amid continuing uncertainty about the trade war's trajectory. The economic pain seems to have softened Mr. Trump's appetite for a fight. On Friday, the president said the two sides would now work on a deal in phases, a reversal from his previous position that he was looking for a complete China deal, not an interim agreement. It's such a big deal that doing it in sections, in phases, is really better, Mr. Trump said during a White House meeting with Liu He, China's vice premier. So you'll either have 2 phases or 3 phases. First phase could be signed when Mr. Trump appears alongside Xi Jinping, his Chinese counterpart, at a meeting of global leaders in Santiago, Chile in November. The next phase would begin soon after, Mr. Trump said. Despite the announcement, a deal has not been reached, and Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, said that more work remained, including on the agreements related to currency. access for American financial companies. We have a fundamental agreement on the key issues, he said, but there is a significant amount of work to do. The deal is far from the type of comprehensive agreement Mr. Trump has been pushing for, and it leaves some of the administration's biggest concerns about China's economic practices unresolved. Although exact terms are still under discussion, the details the president announced include some of the concessions that China has previously floated, including purchase of agricultural products and limits on Beijing devaluing its currency to gain a competitive advantage. Still, the agreement, which came during the 13th round of negotiations, will help to diffuse trade tensions that have begun inflicting pain on the global economy and bolster business across the Pacific. In his quest to force China to acquiesce to America's term, Mr. Trump has already taxed $360 billion worth of Chinese products and has penciled in another round of tariffs on December 15th. Stock and commodity prices climbed on Friday as investors anticipated a resolution to the trade spat. The S&P 500 rose 1.1%. The technologically heavy NASDAQ Composite Index rose 1.3%. The Russell 2000 Index of small capitalization stocks, typically viewed as closely tied to the health of the American domestic economy, rose 1.8%. Crude oil prices rose, as did prices for key industrial metals such as copper and iron ore, often looked to as a barometer of the outlook for China's large industrial economy. Stocks of companies with heavy exposure to China soared. Shares of Deere & Company rose 1.9%, while Apple gained 2.7%, and Wynn Resorts, which generates the bulk of its revenue from casinos in China, surged 6.3%. An index of semiconductor companies, which depend on Asian supply chains, gained 2.3%. Business groups expressed relief that the negotiations between the United States and China appeared to be making progress after more than a year of sputtering, yet they acknowledged that the agreement fell short of the sweeping deal that Mr. Trump had promised. John Nefer, the president of the Semiconductor Industry Association, said the deal was welcome news for his industry that would give both sides a chance to get back to the negotiating table and strike a more comprehensive deal. The initial reaction among Republican lawmakers was cautiously optimistic. Senator Charles E. Grassley of Iowa, the Republican chairman of the Finance Committee, said that any progress was good news, but that Mr. Trump must reach a more substantial deal for the pain of the trade war to have been worthwhile. After so much has been sacrificed, Americans will settle for nothing less than a full, enforceable and fair deal with China, Mr. Grassley said. I look forward to learning more details in the coming days. Trade experts in China were quick to welcome the deal as a breakthrough. In the first time since the start of the trade war that negotiators have reached some solid result, said Cui Fan, a prominent professor of trade policy at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Mr. Trump's defenders say China's concessions will generate positive momentum for future talks and result in more business for farmers and manufacturers as they continue to press Beijing for a broader pact to correct long-standing economic abuses. Critics say that the move will only go partway towards resolving a crisis of the president's own making, and that the trade war will consider to slow the global economy. Beyond the hype, there is nothing more than a partial and ostensibly unsustainable deal, lacking in real enforcement mechanisms, said Gregory Dacko, the chief United States economist at Oxford University. For business, this will mean less damage, not greater certainty. The interim agreement also does not resolve some of the thorniest issues between the two countries, including whether the United States will continue to label China a currency manipulator and whether it will keep Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant, on a government blacklist. In August, the Treasury Department formally designated China a currency manipulator for the first time since 1994 at the direction of Mr. Trump. The largely symbolic move came amid frustration among American officials that China was counteracting the president's tariffs by devaluing the renminbi. Mr. Mnuchin said that the United States would decide whether to rescind the designation in a future phase of negotiations, and Robert Lighthizer, Mr. Trump's top trade negotiator, said the deal did not resolve the fate of Huawei, which is banned from buying American products, much to China's dismay. In this agreement, we're not specifically dealing with Huawei, he said. It's not part of this agreement. That's a separate process. Mr. Trump and his advisors also did not mention any progress in any areas that the American business community has identified as crucial to its ability to compete with Chinese companies, including China's subsidization of industries, the role of the government in the economy, and the country's restrictions on the transfer of data across its borders. Our hope and our aspiration is that they get to those harder issues, said Myron Brilliant, the head of International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Still, he added that the steps taken this week might create positive momentum toward addressing those issues. We've had nothing but bad news since May in the U.S.-China relationship, Mr. Brilliant said. And now we seem to have put a halt to further escalation of tensions, and that's a step in the right direction. Mr. Lighthizer said that the deal would require China to make structural changes to how it screened food imports and approved new products. Genetically modified that would allow more American farm goods to flow there. It will be much easier now for American farmers to be able to ship to China, he said. And we've made some changes on our side too that will help the Chinese. The agreement came after Chinese officials shifted their position on trade talks over the past month, moving from an insistence on a complete removal of the American tariffs to a willingness to accept a partial deal that would leave many of those tariffs in place. One important factor in China's shifting stance involved a severe yet unexpected problem, a genuine need for food imports from the United States. African swine fever has killed an estimated 2/5 of China's pig herd over the past year, producing a sharp increase in pork prices. The need for increased food imports from the United States persuaded the Chinese that both sides could benefit from a partial deal, even if it did not completely involve complete elimination of Mr. Trump's new tariffs. A person familiar with the talks has said, Mr. Trump acknowledged that tensions with China had spiraled as a result of the trade war, but that relations between the two countries were now a love fest. Talk was getting tough, the president said, adding that both sides had planes and ships and that stupid things can happen.